Well, with all this nonsense going on across Australia, and it is nonsense after 18 months, two words should constitute public coronavirus policy: personal responsibility. But is anyone governing the country? In the last 24 hours, the Federal Treasurer agreed with a pessimistic assessment by the White House that Australia should settle in for the long haul of retribution from China's President Xi. Treasurer Frydenberg said, and I quote, "We're living with a different China." And that since he became Treasurer in August 2018, days after Australia became the first country in the world to block Huawei from its 5G rollout, Frydenberg had, quote, "increasingly seen foreign investment applications that are being pursued, not necessarily, he said, for commercial objectives, but for strategic objectives." America's Indo-Pacific coordinator Kurt Campbell has said that Beijing is in no mood to adjust its policy towards Canberra. He said, quote, "I see harshness in their approach that appears to be unyielding. I would have thought that we were basically settling in for the long haul in terms of tensions between China and Australia," unquote. Now, for 15 months, China has exercised a trade coercion campaign on more than $20 billion of our exports. China's foreign ministry spokesman, Zhou Lijian, said this week that China would not allow Australia to, quote, "reap benefits from doing business with China," while groundlessly accusing and smearing China. The foreign ministry spokesman said, "When a certain country acts as a cat's paw for others," meaning that we're doing America's dirty work by criticising China, "when a country acts as a cat's paw for others, it's the people who pay for misguided government policies." Last week, in a speech marking China's 100th anniversary, President Xi said his party wouldn't be pushed around by America or its allies. Quote, "Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people," unquote. And he said China would not, quote, "tolerate sanctimonious preaching from those who feel they have the right to lecture us," unquote. Well, Bob Carr is the former Premier of New South Wales. From 1995 to 2005, he was the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs. From 2012 to 2013, where he differs from all but a few modern politicians is he's a voracious reader and a student of politics. Australia has to face two realities, in my opinion. The first is China are here to stay. The second is we live in their backyard. How should this breakdown in relations be addressed? Mr. Carr joins me. Mr. Carr, thank you for your time. How do you answer that question, given the fracturing of the relationship? How do we address it?
Well, I think the starting point, and it is a difficult challenge, the rise of China, the various agitations that America's gone through. I think the basic resort is a very old one, and something that was invented to enable us to manage a difficult relationship in international affairs, and that's diplomacy. That's diplomacy. For all the challenges we've got in this relationship, and China is more assertive, and America has decided to compete with China and not look the other way while China rises, we could have been a whole lot more diplomatic in managing our relationship without, let me quickly add this, without surrendering any Australian interest. For example, we could have excluded Huawei from our national 5G network, but done so without it looking like Australia was urging the world to follow us and seeking to inflict harm on one of China's iconic companies. We could have done it as discreetly as the Japanese did. They didn't make a fuss about it, and they did it at a bureaucratic level, as did New Zealand. I just think diplomacy has got a lot to teach us. Yeah. And we ought to be increasing our exports to China at this moment, as Japan, as Canada, New Zealand, and even the US is.
Just let me ask you this: does the fact that post-Trump, notwithstanding the cognitive weaknesses of Biden, that if America, Europe, Japan and India came together, might China recalibrate or pull back some of its actions against Australia?
Well, whether it does or doesn't, it's a legitimate response for Australia to work more closely with Japan and India and the US in this so-called Quad. And again, I would use the language of diplomacy. I wouldn't be shouting to the rooftops. This is all directed at China. I'd be saying, if I were Foreign Minister today, this is all about us deepening other relationships in the region. But that Quad, what you referred to, that intensifying cooperation between those countries, India joining the others in particular, the shift by India very significant, is in fact a message. It is in fact a message to Beijing that force produces counterforce. It's really international relations 101, and it's in our interest to deepen cooperation with those other countries so that there's a balance. So there's a balance in the region. That's legitimate.
Yeah. No matter what team you're in, I mean, those who can't identify their weaknesses are destined to fail. Now, I often wonder if we're our own worst enemies. I mean, 20 years ago, there was a significant focus, for example, on Asian language learning. That's in decline. The Hawke government had a national Asian languages policy. It's disappeared. Do we still focus too much in presenting news to our viewers and listeners and readers of America and the UK when we are not an island, as John Menadue has said? John Menadue, the former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, worked under Whitlam and Fraser. Malcolm Fraser actually appointed him ambassador to Japan. But Menadue said, we're not an island moored off London and New York. So have we got our focus? Are we out of focus?
Yeah, I think we are. I love the Anglophone world. I love the Anglosphere. Like you, I'm very comfortable dealing with our American cousins, Canadians, the New Zealanders. It's our first circle of friends. But we really ought to know far more about China. The fact that we kicked out, we roughed up Chinese journalists here, and China, in keeping with its more assertive character, kicked out the Australian journalists there, means that the Australian public have got no idea that, to quote John Key, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, if you want to understand China, you've got to think about Singapore on steroids. You've got to think about China comprising 30 Singapores. Australians who haven't been to China got no idea of the modernity of Chinese cities, or that they're all linked now by high-speed rail. How many Australians appreciate that China leads in significant categories, most categories, I'm told, of artificial intelligence. Southern China used to produce 70% of the world's shoes. They're getting out of that. That's old-fashioned. That's low grade. They produce 70% of the world's drones. China, which is the biggest buyer of robots in the world, is, not surprisingly, now the biggest manufacturer of robots in the world. Now, we don't know enough about this, and there's got to be a better exchange and education about our most important economic partner. Our most important economic partner is vital.
We always run out of time, but I just want to ask you this before we go. I mean, you're absolutely right. Do we know enough? But if we've got company directors and CEOs and all the rest of us who can't even speak an Asian language, how the hell do we have appropriate dialogue with our neighbours?
Effectively, there are no Australian background, non-Chinese background, non-migrant Chinese background students studying Chinese in Australia. There are a handful of them. It's the Chinese background migrants in Australia who are providing our Chinese language skills. It is a hard language to learn. You've got to have immersion. The key is this. You make progress in a primary school teaching Chinese if you teach other subjects in Chinese. That is very hard. It's very demanding. Absolutely. Someone who's doing Chinese for the HSC ought to have that counted as 2 subjects. 100%. It's only with innovative policies like 100%.
That. Look, we're off the pace. We've off the time too. Look, lovely to talk to you. I think we should talk to you again. It is a big story. We're here, they're there. They're not going away. They're our neighbours.
They're not going away.
No,
they're
absolutely.
not going away.
Great to talk to you, Bob Carr. Okay. Thank you for your time. There he is, the former Foreign Minister.